Good evening, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and welcome to the Georgetown University in Qatar FIFA World Cup 2022 lecture series. My name is Ahmed Dalal and I am the Dean of Georgetown University's Qatar campus. Tonight's event is part of a larger effort by Georgetown to deliver high-quality research-informed analysis of current events in our virtual hub for global dialogue, engaging communities, and finding solutions. This initiative comprises 4 sets of public lectures and 1 executive education training program that brings together experts, scholars, government leaders, and industry professionals to stimulate thinking and discussion around key issues defining our world today. If you're interested, please feel free to learn more about our upcoming lectures and trainings by visiting our virtual hub for global dialogue website. It's on our webpage, www.qatar.georgetown.edu virtual hub. It is indeed a part of our larger research strategy to observe the developments related to the World Cup from a social science lens. Our commitment to scholarship and training around sports dates all the way back to the work of our Office of Executive and Professional Education that initially helped Jusur Institute develop an academic framework and certification for a diploma program to train sports management professionals in preparation for the FIFA World Cup Qatar 2022 in the early days. Our Center for International and Regional Studies, CIRS, has also established working groups on sport, politics, and society in the Middle East, leading to a publication on the topic by today's moderator, and another forthcoming publication on football in the Middle East, which hopefully will appear in the coming months. These working groups are a driving force in bringing together top minds across academia, the education city multiversity community, and national institutions, such as the Supreme Committee of Delivery and Legacy, Aspire, and the Qatar Football Association, to tackle the importance of football in the region. This fall, CIRS will launch an even more targeted FIFA World Cup 2022 project, which aims to explore the implications of staging this particular World Cup on the social, political, and economic development of Qatar, as well as on the regional and global affairs. Its projected outcome is to produce analysis and publications on the legacy of the 2022 World Cup in Qatar under the supervision of our host and moderator for tonight, Dr. Daniel Reich. Which brings us back to our discussion for the evening. Our moderator tonight is Georgetown University Qatar Visiting Associate Professor Daniel Reich, who is with us from the American University of Beirut, where he is a tenured associate professor in comparative politics. He obtained his PhD in political science from Leibniz University of Hanover. And in addition to his expertise in sports politics, he has also written extensively about energy policy. Dr. Reich co-edited the 2019 Georgetown University Qatar CIRS sponsored book, Sport, Politics, and Society in the Middle East, published by Oxford University Press. And he's the author of the 2016 book, Successes and Failures of Countries at the Olympic Games. He will be speaking tonight with Dr. David Goldblatt. And although I will let Dr. Reich introduce Dr. Goldblatt, I just wanted to thank Dr. Goldblatt for joining us tonight and for engaging with Dr. Reich on the FIFA World Cup in 2022, which has been so central to driving development in Qatar. This event is an example of the important place that research and analysis have in offering insight into the events and issues of our day for both academics and for the general public. We are honored to provide a platform for this conversation, which will be followed by an open discussion with the audience. Thank you for joining us, and I invite you to the next event in the series on November. In November, we will announce the exact date later, featuring Matthias Krug, another expert on football in Qatar. Now it's my pleasure to turn the platform over to Dr. Reich. Thank you, Dr. Reich, for moderating the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dean Dalal, for your kind introduction and vision to establish a scholarly debate about the FIFA World Cup 2022 at our university. I look forward to our World Cup lecture series as well as our World Cup research initiative at CIRS, the Center for International and Regional Studies at Georgetown University, Qatar, that will be launched soon. So, David, now I want to give you the word. The World Cup in Qatar will be the 22nd edition of the World Cup. The first one in 1930 has been in Uruguay, which is some similarity with Qatar as it's another small country, but all the other editions were more with like big powerhouses. So I'm excited to learn what are your views on the World Cup in Qatar in historical perspectives, what are similarities, but also differences to previous editions of this greatest sporting event in the world.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you all for having me and for being with us this afternoon. I'm just going to try and speak for 10 minutes and give us a historical frame of reference on this question. And as Daniel suggested, the starting point, of course, is to think about the first World Cup in 1930 held in Uruguay. And at first glance, it's another world. The main way in which the 1930 World Cup was consumed is by radio. And of course, 2022 will be consumed on the internet. What tiny little bit of film footage there is in black and white. And Qatar 2022 will be in high definition color on a million different screens. In 1930, there are just 13 teams, all of them, none of the players are professionals. The 4 teams from Europe come on a liner across the ocean. So technologically, and in terms of the global transport networks, this is a completely different era. And yet look more closely, and 1930 connects very clearly to the experience of the World Cup in our own time, and indeed specifically to what I think will be the experience of 2022. In the first place, no World Cup is complete without the mania of celebration and defeat in public space. Indeed, in some ways, that is the most crucial part of a World Cup and of the collective experience of the World Cup. And Montevideo was flooded with crowds for a month every time Uruguay won a game. Similarly, one of the features of the 2022 World Cup and recent World Cups is large numbers of people gather to watch the football on a screen all over the world. You know, the World Cup doesn't happen anymore just in the 8 stadiums in which the theatrically staged games are played, but almost everywhere. And we find this in 1930, where the plazas of Buenos Aires, outside of the main newspapers, people are standing there listening to collective radios or to ticker tape reports coming through to the newspaper offices. And as Daniel suggested, there is something of size and moment. Although Uruguay, a country in Latin America on the Atlantic, Qatar in the Gulf in the Middle East, actually they're about the same size, 2.5 million people, very compact. Almost all of the games played in a tiny number of stadiums in a very small physical area. And in both cases, it's a real moment in the social political development of those countries. In 1930, Uruguay was emerging into the world and asking yourself, who and what are we? And football became the instrument after winning the 24 and 28 Olympic Games and then agreeing to host the games in 1930 and put up the money. And this was, you know, a message to the rest of the world celebrating the 100th centenary of Uruguay's democratic constitution and telling the world that what was referred to then as the Switzerland of Latin America, the 6th country indeed in the world, ahead at the time, with a nascent democracy and the first welfare state in Latin America, was showing the world what it could do and using football and architectural statements to do so. The Centenario Stadium that staged the 1930 World Cup final remains, for my money, the most beautiful stadium ever built in the history of the game. And this is not a million miles from where Qatar is, a small country that has undergone a hectic and rapid form of social and political development, seeking its position in the world and working out what its modern national narrative has chosen, amongst many things, but above all has chosen football as an instrument for doing that, both at home and abroad. What has changed though? Clearly the 2022 World Cup is not 1930. For many years, the World Cup actually remained a pretty small institution. 1934 was Mussolini's World Cup and had the money and the power of the fascist state behind it for similar reasons to Uruguay. But for nearly 40 years, the World Cup is a small affair. Television is barely present, only black and white, rarely live. It's only actually in the 1970s that live color television becomes a feature of the games. Beyond the Maracanã, built in 1950 for the Brazilian World Cup, the level of building and ambition is almost zero. I mean, in 1966, when England won the World Cup, literally they gave it a new lick of paint. And that was the World Cup development program for 1966. And we had national, these are moments still of great importance. The Hungarians and the Germans in 1954, the Brazilian defeat in 50, but then the winning in 58 and 62, England finally winning in 66 are central elements of these countries' national myths and narratives. But as a global phenomena, it is much, much more limited. Things change in the 70s and 80s. The Mexico World Cup is, I think, the defining moment. A, because it's in color television and it's live. B, because it's part of the Mexican state's program of using mega events, the 68 Olympics followed by the 70 Games, to really send a big message with money and architectural style behind it. Also, this is the era when João Havelange takes over FIFA. And so we have the first serious commercialization and televisualization of the World Cup. So that by 1986, you have sponsors, you have serious television deals, you have global live television to a world where television is now spread beyond Europe and North America, but is a part of everyday life on almost every continent. And 1986, in a way, marks the end of that era. Anyone who's ever watched the extraordinary scenes when Argentina win in the final and the crowd invade the pitch, an unimaginable feature of World Cups. Maybe Qatar 2022 can remedy that absence. So really, Qatar 2022 needs to be seen in the perspective of the last 20 or 30 years of World Cups to make serious historical comparison. Modern football and the modern World Cup is really born of Italian 1990. The scale of political ambition compared to the previous 50 years is much higher than it has been before. The cost and the scale of rebuilding has risen. Above all, football, always popular through the 20th century, has, I would argue, in the 1990s and the 21st century, become without question the most popular form of popular culture in the world, bar none. In a truly globalized era, it is the most globalized form of popular culture. Nothing but nothing comes close. And the World Cup status and cultural importance has risen on the back of that. How else has it changed? Well, of course, the digital revolution has changed. The scale of the money has changed. But I want to point to just a couple of innovations and changes that really seem to me to have changed the character of the World Cup in the last 20 years. One, South Korea 2002, Japan 2002, big screens arrive. This takes the World Cup out of the stadium. The solidarity, the communality, the carnival, the collectivity that football generates is given a massive boost by finally we can have, in the case of South Korea, 7.6 million people on the streets. Think about that, people. 7.6 million people on the streets to watch the semi-final of the World Cup. I mean, revolutions don't do 7.6 million. This is an extraordinary figure. And now we see everywhere around the world during the World Cup this repeated at some level or another. I think this changes the character of it. Secondly, 2006, the Love Mile in Germany, the loved up beer fest that was Berlin during the World Cup, in which the occupation of public space during the World Cup becomes its central carnivalesque form, the point where we all become part of the World Cup, where the World Cup actually takes over the city. And the arrival of social media and the smartphone, which remember is actually not very long ago, has meant that those images and those sensations are sent out 1 million times around the world at a scale that old journalist-based media never could. Russia 2018, to a great extent, and the good vibes that were generated around it for the country, were generated by the second-hand experience of that extraordinary occupation of carnivalesque public space in Russia. Third transformation, 2014 and 2018 in particular, Brazil, Russia, both part of a wider program of using the hosting of sporting mega events to send out complex political messages both at home and abroad. Both of these countries host the World Cup alongside an Olympics, Sochi in the case of Russia, 2016 Rio in the case of Brazil. And here Qatar is clearly part of the same drift, the shift towards the global south, the shift towards using mega events, not merely as a branding exercise, but something really much larger in scale. So where does 2020 sit in the overall history of the World Cup? How does it look looking back on that exposition of it? The first thing to say is it's going to be unique. This is the first one in the winter for climatological, obviously, conditions. And for that reason, if no other, it will be unique. I do fear for the outdoor viewing here in the global north, where things are going to be rather cold in November by comparison to the usual June. But I guess, under conditions of COVID, we'll all have learned to be outside a bit more than we have in the past. More substantially, I think, and this builds on the experience of the 2010 World Cup in South Africa, which was considered Africa's World Cup, as well as South Africa's World Cup. I think so Qatar stands in relation to the wider Middle Eastern region. It is an extraordinary and I think actually rather underwritten moment in the discussion of Qatar 2022, that this is the first world sports mega event of significance in a Muslim majority, Arab speaking Middle Eastern country. Everybody else has had their share of the global limelight, and finally it comes to the region. And I think in a deeply fragmented and is often Islamophobic world, I think this is of profound importance and significance. How much the world recognizes this as something more than Qatar's World Cup is yet, I think, to be decided. I am not hearing, and I am receptive to that message. It will be very interesting to see whether it is possible to generate the sort of Pan-African vibes you had in 2010, where everybody got behind Ghana, and where South Africa, African music and dance and culture was reflected in the program. Can Qatar 2022 do the same for the Middle East? Can it be a really profound moment in the history of organized mega events and finally put the Middle East seriously on the map, not just in institutional terms, but in experiential and emotional terms? The third thing to say, and this will be no surprise to anyone here, but I think it must be reflected on, is that the trend to use the World Cup and the Olympics as an instrument of urban regeneration, of social transformation, of transforming your relationships with the rest of the world, and of sending a variety of soft power messages, this is not new. It has been growing. We all thought that 40 billion for 2008 Beijing and 55 for Sochi 2014 was the peak. They all pale into insignificance against what Qatar has done in the last 10 years. I mean, it is the most extraordinary experiment in using sport in general, football in particular, and the World Cup above all, to drive the transformation, indeed the building of urban Qatar. And to place it so centrally in the foreign policy of a sovereign nation state is truly a unique. What the consequences will be, it seems to me, and whether it will work is a matter for discussion. But the very scale of the sociological, political and urban ambition of Qatar 2022 is simply without precedent. A final note, I'm a connoisseur of the boring environmental document that accompanies mega events. And in the last 20 years, the world sports community has been inching its way towards an understanding of the consequences of sport for climate change and the impact of climate change and other environmental issues on sport itself. The 2006 World Cup in Germany was the first to have a proper environmental dimension to it. 2014 and 2018 had full-scale carbon footprint analysis and plans to do something about it, which I think are probably best consigned to the comedy script part of one's library. 2022 is genuinely something different. The commitment of the Qatar 2022 World Cup to carbon zero and the seriousness with which it has been pursued at the level of construction and public transport is truly unique. This is not to say it is perfect. I would argue that Qatar 2022 and indeed all international sporting events need to be offsetting and dealing with the enormous carbon emissions generated by the aviation and other transport that brings people to the tournament. About 70% probably of the carbon emissions. Nonetheless, it is an extraordinary document and praiseworthy, and I think is going to set a standard for future World Cups. One hopes further down the line, I mean, there's the paradox, of course, that Qatar is a hydrocarbon state, and this thing has been built on hydrocarbon money, and that Gazprom, one of the most problematic oil companies for climate change and gas companies, is a sponsor of the World Cup. Nonetheless, we are where we are, and I think that the environmental ambition of Qatar 2022 is not only unique in the World Cup terms, I think this is something pretty unique in global sport. A final thought is, as our old friend Hegel said, the owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. You know, translates as you don't really know what's going to happen till it's happened, and then you work it out. And football has a really, really extraordinary way of just turning the world upside down. You can never really predict what is going to happen at the World Cup, what stories are going to emerge, and how the rest of the world is going to interpret it. So in that regard, the history of, Qatar's place in the history of the World Cup, we see the main lines, but there's an awful lot of the unknown still to come.
Thank you, David. That was a fantastic introduction. I mean, of course, one of the issues is COVID-19 when you're saying we don't know what's going to happen. Those of you who missed the introduction, I will ask some questions to David before we open up the discussion to all participants. However, if you want, you can already start typing your questions into the Q&A feature. David, when the World Cup was awarded to Qatar in 2010, it received a lot of criticism. And the three main critics were, first, the issue with migrant workers in Qatar, which we are going to discuss a bit later, please. But the other two main critics were that it's going to be in the heat, an issue that is resolved now with moving the event to the winter. And the third issue was that Qatar is not a football country. They don't have a strong national football team. However, they won the Asian Cup last year. And maybe you could talk a bit about like small states in sports, small states in football. In your beautiful book, you are discussing the case of Iceland, showing that even a very tiny country can be successful in sports. So I believe you are a fan of Icelandic football. So what can Qatar, for example, and other small states learn from Iceland?
So Iceland is an extraordinary story. Not really much of a footballing nation, low rates of participation, no presence in international football until the 2000s. And a combination of factors have transformed Iceland's football culture and football progress. The first is an infrastructure issue, building the houses of football. Obviously, Iceland's, it's not very easy to play football in the winter in Iceland. So you had a massive investment in heated indoor facilities for almost every community in the country. And that just changes the possibilities of playing football. The second thing that they did was to really focus on making it available to youth. You had a real youth drinking issue and youth social issues in Iceland. And one of the things they did to change the situation was to offer vouchers to kids saying, free activities of different kinds. And one of these was football. So it became free. So people took up. Suddenly you've got people piling into playing football. Thirdly, you've got the mobilization of civil society. I mean, what's going on, although you've got some money from above and some government input, the energies and the enthusiasm are coming from below, not just from individuals, but networks of individuals, of families, of communities who really transform the experience of playing and following football in Iceland and make it a kind of absolutely central community event and experience. And fourthly, education. Iceland has invested in coaching. The quality of coaching in Iceland at grassroots football, it's like, I don't know, it's like, having a kind of primary school education system where everybody's got a PhD in the classroom. Here, the number of per capita head of coaches, the number of UEFA A and B coaches in Iceland per capita head is greater, I think, than anywhere in the world. So you put those four things together and you have an incredibly, vibrant local football culture that generates and nurtures talent. You also have, a small number of folks who've played overseas at the elite level, because I think that's another part. All of that takes you so far, but you want to make it to the last 16 of the Euros or to the World Cup, which is an extraordinary thing, then you need some of your elite players playing overseas. Iceland has managed that. And I should emphasize, though we know the men's story primarily because of their World Cup and Euro appearances, this is now happening in women's football. And Iceland's women's football team, I have absolutely no doubt, will be following on. I mean, rates of female participation in football in Iceland, I think, are pretty much, apart from the United States, unprecedented. So I think the key thing for Qatar, looking at something like this, and my understanding of Qatari football is it's primarily been stimulated from above. It's a state project. And yes, there are really, really effective state and parastatal institutions shaping football in Qatar. Where is the energy from below? And I think that's what Qatar, if you want to have an Iceland, you can't just do it from above. You have to mobilize and train your own population and give them the reins of power at a certain level to make it happen.
Okay, many great thoughts. My next question, David, 5 of the last 6 men's World Cups were won by European countries. In your beautiful book, The Age of Football, you are arguing that the globalization of football is mainly a Europeanization. With the arrival of satellite TV, most global attention has gone to few European leagues, particularly the EPA, the English Premier League. Would you consider Qatar's investments into football as a welcomed diversification of the Eurocentric global football system?
Well, a good question. I'm not sure that it is actually diversifying it, in the sense that, Qatar's investment in PSG seems to me to be reinforcing some of the problems of inequality, lack of competitive advantage, relentless focus on Europe. That's money spent on reproducing the same problem. That said, and secondly, I should say that at the level of international governance, if not, if you like, cultural and spectator attention, international football has always been more than just a European stitch-up. Latin America has, long punched above its weight in the corridors of power. And more recently, both Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia have all begun to kind of find their way. That said, I think it's, I think it's welcome. I think it's welcome that the rest of the world is catching up. I do wonder, though, whether, really what breaks the overweening Europeanization of global football is whether people like their own domestic game or not. I mean, that's the big issue in Africa, where 400 million people are watching the Premier League every weekend, and who can blame them? But with the consequence that attendance and interest at domestic African football has completely plummeted. And what were once kind of really great and interesting, musically and sportingly diverse African football cultures have been pretty much, you know, hollowed out by the departure of fans' attentions elsewhere. So I'm really interested further down the line to see how Qatar, whether Qatar can build its own domestic football culture, and how much of a challenge that is, and how much Qatar's development policies can also challenge some of the kind of, and this has begun, the long-standing, you know, powers in football in the region. You know, before it's a global challenge, I think there's a regional challenge, and the Asian Cup was a really interesting example of that. But I think ultimately, if you want to stop people focusing relentlessly on Europe, it's about, do you want to watch your own football or not?
Yes. So in your book, you're doing like a global survey. It's really impressive. You're like discussing more or less every country. And according to this survey, international football is not in a good shape. So whatever country we discuss, apart from very few exceptions, there's fan violence, corruption, racism, and cheating. And this is occurring in most football leagues. So Qatar established in 2010 the International Center for Sport Security, ICSS, with a quote, vision of what sport could be, a unifying, positive and inspiring force for good, free from corruption and played in stadiums and arenas that are safe for all. Qatar is also committed to, as you mentioned in your introductory statement, to delivering a carbon neutral 2022 World Cup. So do you think Qatar might become a role model in global football?
It's hard to be a role model in the sense that Qatar has got the kind of resources to play with that most folks don't. And therefore reproducing the Qatari model is going to be difficult, I would say. I mean, I think there are elements of what Qatar has done that may be reproducible elsewhere, but I think it's pretty much, in that regard, it's a one-off. Can those institutions, can you lead by example? There's a more complex question. I mean, you know, corruption in football, just to begin there, let's remember, you know, football is corrupt because the world is corrupt. This is not football's particular problem. Corruption exists, you know, in most features, certainly economic features of life. Football is, I'm not sure actually it's much worse than any other. Can something be done about that? What is the contribution? I mean, in a way, the most important contribution to that would be that the powers of the global north in the City of London and Wall Street stop laundering everybody's stolen money. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we have so much corruption, is that it's so much easier to hide your money once you've stolen it. And that is not Qatar's doing. That is, you know, that's going on in the City of London. I do think, you know, and again, I can't speak for Qatar, but, you know, we are long overdue a serious reform and democratization of international sporting bodies, not just football, but all of them, from the IOC down. I mean, we have labored under a system basically invented, you know, in the era of gentlemen's clubs, in which international sporting federations exist in a kind of legal netherworld where so much can be hidden and it's so hard to do anything about it. So that's where the real, you know, if we're gonna make some changes there, that's where the energy, I would encourage anyone to put their energies into focusing on those issues.
In my class on sports, politics, and society in the Middle East, which I'm teaching this semester at Georgetown, Qatar, we just read over the weekend your 64 pages long chapter on the Middle East in the book, The Age of Football. The following three questions I'm asking you are from my students. The first question they want me to ask you is, There have been rumors that one of the motives for the blockade against Qatar is the jealousy of neighboring Gulf countries over Qatar hosting the World Cup. Do you think there is some truth to this?
I think there's some truth. I mean, I think in the end, this is a much bigger conflict about geopolitical power, influence, and economics. Of course, it is also shaped by old enmities, and there are plenty of Qatar's neighbours who I think would like to take it down a peg or two, and having the World Cup just kind of scratches that thing even more. And I think it is testament to the extent to which not just Qatar, but a whole number of states, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, to name just but three, have chosen to use football as a marker of their own social development, an instrument of international influence and economic regeneration. So when your neighbour gets the absolute plum prize and you've decided that that's really important in politics, it's going to be part of the mix. So I do think it's part of it. I don't think it's the mainspring of the conflict, but it is clearly part of that.
Okay. Next question. The last page of the chapter discusses Qatar's promises to end the kafala system, written in a discouraging tone that these promises won't be met. However, recently Qatar announced the introduction of new measures to protect workers' rights. What do you think of this new advancement? Do you believe Qatar will remain to do so after the World Cup, or will progressiveness halt the moment the World Cup is over?
I wrote it with, the adjective I would use is just with a heavy heart. As a long-term observer of international sport, I have heard many promises from many nations and many sporting authorities that the openness and transparency that a mega event forces on a nation will lead to political and economic liberalisation. We certainly heard this argument in 2008 with regard to the Beijing Olympics, and I don't think any of us are taking that too seriously. So I'm a bit of a skeptic in this world, and obviously I wrote that piece before the latest developments. So I will say the latest developments in Qatar's commitment to the reform of not just the labour system, but also the introduction of a minimum wage and some changes in the citizenship system, actually are pretty remarkable. I mean, the kafala system has been central to Qatar's mode of production, I would say. I mean, whole economic system. It's not just about the World Cup. So if what has been promised is delivered on, actually that will be completely exceptional. I mean, we've never had an international sporting event which has led to this degree of change. The only comparable example, I would say, is the influence of hosting the 1988 Seoul Olympics on the South Korean democratization process, where one can genuinely argue that the South Korean military and political elite really did have to take a breath. It's like, do we really want to go down the hard line of repression when we're about to stage the global festival of sport? And it was a real part of the calculation. And I don't understand the internal politics of Qatar, of which, of course, this is deeply connected. But I think this is, I think the World Cup has really made a difference. I think it's a very bold set of changes. And while I remain skeptical, as I remain skeptical of pretty much everything in this world, I would be delighted to be proved wrong. And, as they say, only time will tell. But I don't underestimate or belittle in any way the significance of the commitments that have recently been made. I mean, compared to what's going on in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or other places where a similar labour system is working, this is real change. So I will be delighted if the tone of the age of football is proved incorrect.
The last question from my students is more on sports. As you appropriately mentioned in the chapter, there is indeed an attendance problem in many of Qatar's sporting events where stadiums are noticeably empty. even when the tickets to these events are made free. What can the Supreme Committee do to ensure that the World Cup matches are filled with spectators? Do you think there will be many empty seats in 2022?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it all depends what the COVID situation is, of course, but let's assume the COVID situation is like we're back to normal in stadiums. World Cups, generally don't have too many empty seats. There were empty seats at the last few. I mean, partly it's, there is a pricing issue. At World Cups, particularly the hospitality packages sold through Match. I don't know if that's still going to be the case for 2022, but they've, the company run by Blatter's cousin has had the monopoly on selling high-end packages and expensive tickets at the World Cup, and they're often empty. I mean, I went to a game in South Africa in 2010 between South Korea and Greece, in which the whole VIP section was just completely empty. And of course, nobody locally could possibly afford the sorts of tickets. And the ticket prices at recent World Cups, I think, have been really, really outrageous. I would like to see more broadly, more local people being able to attend World Cups. It's lovely to have, the visitors and the fans. But, there are so many people at World Cup games that I've been to who are kind of like, oh, you just got to get a World Cup ticket. It's like tourism. They're not really interested. They're on their phone most of the time. They're not engaged. They're often, like ticking it off your bucket list. So how can you get more locals and more people who just really like football inside the stadium? I think you have to. South Africa reserved a lot of tickets for local folks and made them available in cash without a credit card, because most people didn't have a credit card. That may not be a problem in Qatar, but I would say, and I would encourage the Qatari authorities to make sure that local folks, by which I'm both meaning Qatari citizens, but also the vast number of migrant workers, to make sure they've got tickets. I mean, if you built a World Cup stadium, I would really like to think, after the extraordinary efforts that involved, is that those folks are in the stadium as well. So some cheaper tickets, some tickets just for locals, I think would be a good start.
Yes, I agree. That's a good point. Thank you, David. Now we are at a half time of our event. We are going now into the second half. And to your questions, I'm delighted to see that we're having more than 100 participants, and you continue typing your questions into the Q&A feature, but there are also two participants who raised their hand to ask their question by audio. And I saw that the first one was my Dutch colleague, Gijsbert Ong. Gijsbert, could you please ask your question? Gijsbert, you need to unmute your microphone.
Now it should work.
Yes, we hear you. Great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, David, for your great introduction. I also really enjoyed reading your book. I'm quite new to sport and sport history, so for me it was a great starting point. Actually, after the book, I thought, I know everything now, but there are always new questions and new things. So I'm interested in migration and national identity. And I have a question that's related to that regarding to World Cups. So Qatar, as Daniel already started, is not really a football-loving country. They don't have a strong national team, though they won the Asian Cup, as Daniel said. But they won the Asian Cup also with the usage of players that were born in Africa. And they came through the Aspire program. In our research, we show that there are actually more foreign-borns in the World Cups, and that's also why, for example, African countries identify with the French in 2018 and the French World Cup. So my question is, do you see, what are your thoughts about changing identification with national teams? Like Daniel said, European teams, they seem to dominate World Cups, but I also see that fans and fandoms are actually quite flexible. So we are in Holland. If Holland loses, but Belgium is still there, then it's okay. I remember I was in Mauritius, which is also a very small country with no football tradition. But there, the idea was that if you say, for example, do like Tottenham Hotspur or Liverpool in those days, this was 2010, then you also support the Netherlands because their account was footballing for Liverpool. You know, all that kind of new ideas came up.
Okay.
Do you see this changing in World Cups? Is this happening?
I think you do see these things at World Cups. I mean, you know, when Ghana were the last team in the South African World Cup, you know, South Africa instantly renamed them Bagana, you know, which is a pun on Bafana, the name of the South African team. And they absolutely, you know, I mean, Pan-Africanism probably has a longer and deeper tradition in football than in many other regions. But I think, you know, the whole world is like pretty much anyone but England as their first choice as neutral, which I completely understand. And I think people do have more than one team. You know, only 32 teams can go to the World Cup in the end. I mean, it's going to be 48 soon, but even so not everyone's there. So who are you going to support? Much of the global South, it seems to me, chooses Brazil, I think rather unwisely, as their kind of tribunes. And there are all sorts of reasons that people come up with, you know, my enemy's enemy is my friend is often a reason for supporting teams. So I think we do see complexities, you know, and I think we see complexities in individuals. So, you know, Mexican Americans, you know, who just can't, you know, they feel American, but they can't support America. So they actually have to support Americans supporting the Mexican national team. I mean, in the World Cup, you know, football in general is extraordinary public theatre for these issues, and it can work in both directions, you know. On the one hand, it can make everything lovely and beautiful and cosmopolitan and inclusive. So, you know, the moment when Ian Wright is standing alone in the England team in Morocco and they've lost the recording of God Save the Queen and they have to sing it by themselves. And the only man who really knows the word and is prepared to sing it unaccompanied is a young black man from London, Ian Wright. And that's, you know, this is England. What a moment that was in transforming perceptions of the English nation and of English football. On the other hand, it works the other way, you know, as Mesut Ozil always says, you know, when things are going well, I'm a German player. When things are going badly, I'm a Turkish German. And, you know, football becomes a place where actually integration is challenged. So football's an amazing public theatre. It can work both ways. I mean, in the case of Qatar, I am really interested, you know, if the Qatari national football team, you know, is going to serve as the tribune of the nation, and as it has everywhere else, why shouldn't it? As, you know, the moment where the imagined community does its imagining and dreaming as to what the nation means. How long can Qatar's sense of itself as, you know, an almost exclusively Arab, kinship networked tiny nation with a large number of visitors and migrant workers? Well, when will that, you know, particularly as the kafala system breaks down and people stay, will this be a moment when Qataris can begin to imagine that actually there are many types of Qataris? You can be a Qatari of African descent. You can be a Qatari, you know, of Asian descent. And there you are in the national football team representing that. So I'm really interested to see how that plays out. I think it's, as I said, one of those things about World Cups and football is you just don't know till people start playing and you see how the world emotionally and intellectually interacts with them.
Yeah, we have 2 more audio questions, but we have also 19 questions in the Q&A feature. So maybe I read them and you try to answer them briefly. So let me start reading some of them. So first by Khalid Issa. I'm happy you mentioned 22 World Cup. In my view, it was the only successful World Cup outside of Europe and UEFA. Countries such as Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa have experienced economic downfalls and lack of legacy left behind after the tournaments. Stadiums left for dead, corruption increased in these nations, and tourism industry barely changes. I'm generally an optimistic guy, but I fear for the worst for what happens to this country after 2022. What can you see going wrong?
Well, you know, after the year that has been 2020, it's like anything can happen. What's the worst that can happen for 2022? What a difficult question. I mean, I don't think we know yet. I mean, I think the worst thing, I suppose, is that the COVID situation does not sort itself out, you know, and then the thought of a World Cup with, at best, socially distant stadiums or otherwise empty stadiums is too grim. I don't even know where to begin, how miserable that would be. So that is the number one thing. And I think we just don't know. We really don't know. We can all be terribly optimistic about vaccines and whatever. We don't know.
Let's be optimistic. I prefer that. Danny Hanoun is asking, hello, thank you for your response. My question is, why has the narrative surrounding the Qatar 2022 World Cup been so overwhelmingly negative, given the deaths of migrant workers in all previous editions, as well as the decimating economic consequences which Qatar will not suffer?
I presume by decimating economic consequences, I don't quite know what he's talking about, but I'm assuming he's saying that if they weren't migrant workers, that would be very bad for the local economies from where they come because they send out back so much money. But that's what I'm assuming that means. What I would say is it's a combination of two things, the negative coverage, three things. Number one is there really just have been more deaths. I mean, of course, lots of people have died. You know, Russia was very bad. Brazil was bad. There is plenty of deaths on construction sites of all kinds all around the world. So Qatar is not unique. The scale is definitely greater. And I know that there is a debate over some are World Cup projects, some are not. I think this is it's not a tasteful debate. The scale of what has gone on is much greater. That said, I think there's also been a lot of Islamophobia. I mean, I think there just is a lot of anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia. And I think there's a lot of folks in the world who just can't hack it. That, you know, this tiny little place that they've never heard of, you know, with whatever cliched understanding of the society they have, people really struggle with that. I think Qatar has also, though, it's different because Qatar has not taken the Russian or the Brazilian option, which is basically to shrug your shoulders and say, whatever, you know, that's what the Russians did. I mean, you know, all those North Koreans in slave conditions working on the stadiums. And in the end, the Russians go, you don't like it? Don't come. Qatar is taking a different option. Qatar is being, I would say, much more transparent. It's much, much more engaged with the world. Access, actually, you know, to working conditions in Qatar is much easier and much greater than, that's not to say it's been entirely open, but much greater than one experienced, certainly in Russia, certainly compared to China 2008. So I think given that, that makes it much more difficult for Qatar. It's going to get more flack.
As the long question, next question by Armstrong is pretty long. I just take a sentence out from it.
Okay.
Apologies, Armstrong. How will the World Cup affect the regional affairs, especially the blockade with Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt still in place?
Well, I guarantee this, that if any of them could manage to qualify for the World Cup, they'll all be there. No one's about to not show up at the World Cup over this. So I think in that regard, you know, it's a blockade breaker. How will it affect it afterwards? I mean, I am not an expert on these things. I don't see any way at the moment that the blockade will cease before 2022. There may be some face-saving operation afterwards where they manage to tone it down. But I think, I mean, again, it just sort of speaks to the potency of football as a political instrument in the region, is that, you know, despite all the political capital and energy and effort staked on the blockade, when it comes to showing up for the World Cup, no one's going to blockade the World Cup. And that's a pretty extraordinary thing.
Yes, I agree. Let's have another live question by audio. Ibrahim Ali, could you please join us and ask your question? You need to unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Thank you. My name is Ibrahim. I'm studying Middle Eastern Studies in the University of Oslo. I'm very happy to join you guys this afternoon.
Thank you.
My question is, as you briefly mentioned, David, could Qatar make this the World Cup of the Arab world, showing the best of Arab culture, modern infrastructure, development and innovation, and in that sense make people across the Arab world or even the Islamic world consider Qatar as a great ambassador for the region despite the tensions politically, like bind the people in between the countries together in that sense?
Well, what a good question. Thank you, Ibrahim. I mean, on the one, it takes two to tango, as we say in England. So if Qatar wants to make this the Arab / Middle East / Islamic World Cup, in some sense, then the rest of those worlds have to agree to play. You know, that in the end is what made South Africa's World Cup did feel like an African World Cup, because the rest of Africa bought into the program. So in a way, it's out of the Qatari authorities' hands in some sense. You know, if the public is no, you know, the Arab street is not entirely pliable on this question. That said, I mean, I think there are lots of things that will and can be done in terms of how it is presented, how money is spent, will make that easier. I mean, I think, you know, probably Qatar having a run to the quarterfinals is the single most important thing that could happen to deliver that. But I think there are really great opportunities to showcase the football culture, food culture, music culture, cinematic and literary cultures, which, you know, are shared across the region. And I would hope that, you know, 2022 takes the opportunity to do that. I think there are lots of options.
Thank you.
I mean, can I just say, I would like to see, you know, for example, the Arab world has a very rich tradition of poetic writing about football. I mean, just listen to the way people commentate as well. So, you know, why not have that in fabulous Arabic, you know, calligraphy and every other language of the participants of the World Cup, and just be putting that as projections on public spaces and big buildings? Fantastic. What a good way of doing it.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Before we have the next live question, I read some more questions from the Q&A feature. Paul Denton is asking, do you see a potential for disruptive fan behavior, for example, hooligans?
But of course, I mean, you know, it's not just, I mean, there are different levels of sort of social disorder. You know, part of the pleasure and the joy of football is that, you know, crowds are slightly unruly and they are a bit edgy. And if it's too sanitized and too pinned down, you really lose something. On the other hand, you know, there are all sorts of pathologies and excesses associated with that. So given that, yes, you know, when you've got large numbers of people consuming alcohol in kind of, you know, sometimes nationalist and rivalry kind of, you know, drenched context, there can be trouble. And we've seen that, you know, the 2006 World Cup, there was a certain amount. The Russians have been active at 2016. I think in some ways this World Cup may be a bit more like the Japan-Korea World Cup of 2002, where a lot of those elements in the support, not just of England, but lots of teams stayed home because it was all a bit too expensive and cosmopolitan and weird. Things have changed since 2002, so I don't know whether that will be the case. But I think, yeah, there will be, you know, you get large numbers of people together, you know, in those situations, there's going to be some issues. I think we've learned a lot about how to police these situations effectively. I mean, the most, if, you need the intelligence, who are the few people who are real trouble. And for that, you need information from local police forces. You need to be collaborating with fan groups out there and with the linguistic and network skills to get hold of them, because half the time these things are best resolved by people policing themselves. And I think if you've got those kinds of networks and contacts established, you're going to have a much smoother, much smoother operation. And, gently policing these things is the most important. I mean, certainly my experience, like the Netherlands, Belgium, 2002 Euros, I mean, most of the trouble was over aggressive policing. I mean, sure, there was some sort of boorish young men drinking too much alcohol and displaying rather too much flesh in public places. But what turned that from something that was just tasteless into something that was actually a public disorder issue was the way the police dealt with it. So I think there's a lot of different ways. I don't think there's going to be that much trouble. And I think it can be all dealt with in very gentle mannered ways.
Yeah. The next question
is, the final just to say is, does the Qatari police force security services have those skills yet? Because this is, this is not like policing the international handball sort of tournaments in Qatar. We're in very, very different territory.
Handball is a major sport in Germany. Don't make jokes about handball, please. So the next question is by an anonymous attendee, and to paraphrase it, he or she is asking whether you think that Qatar will apply to international standards when it comes to like allowing women to wear shorts or whatever they would like, drinking apart from the areas or hotels approved, staying out partying until the next day, etc.
I mean, I'm not the person to ask that question of. That's for the people who run the Qatar 2022 World Cup and run public security in Qatar. It's just absolutely not for me to, to sort of second guess what their policy on these things will be. So I don't know. My understanding on the alcohol issue is that alcohol will be available. It won't just be available inside expensive hotels, but there will be zones both in the stadium and in the fan parks and in other public space. And that there will also be spaces in which there's no alcohol. So choice will be available in that regard. I suspect that's the main route that Qatar will go down, is that it will offer, choice, both options, rather than trying to ban stuff. But I absolutely can't speak for the people who are running this operation.
Another question by an anonymous attendee. If you were advising Qatar on its strategy within the football world, what would you tell them? Covering the World Cup investment and the social aspects, solo football, and anything else you would share?
Oh, well, what would I say? Wow. I mean, there's a lot of need in the football world. So if Qatar is prepared to spend money supporting social development programs in football, there's like, the list just goes on for about 3 miles. I suppose the one sort of more specific thing I would say is that the Aspire Academy and the Aspire program, and the basis, at least in part, of Qatar's men's national team's rise, is the seeking out and nurturing of African talent. And I've also said this of the Premier League. I think Africa, the Premier League has grown rich on African eyeballs and affections, and Qatar has mightily improved its football performance on the back of African talent that it has then offered a path to citizenship. Both need to pay some sort of restitution to the African football cultures that have been undermined. So I would like to see, and would suggest that is, if Qatar wants to make an investment, I would encourage them to make the investment there. But you know, that's it's a big, that's a whole aid strategy to think about.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to have another audio question. Shahir Liaquat raised her hand. Shahir, can you please join us and ask your question? You need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, sir, for your keen analysis. I'd just like to say that the numbers don't make sense for me. And I like your guidance in that matter. Now, the 2026 United bid, Canada plans to spend less than $1 billion on its projects, right? Less than $1 billion. And the price tag for the current World Cup, the future World Cup, is already at $220 billion. And I think this negates your earlier claim as well, that this is sustainable, right? Because, you know, all that money, all the resources that have been devoted to this event, they are not coming back, right? They have been used, they have been spent. So do you believe this is a sustainable approach? Thank you very much.
I mean, do you mean sustainable for Qatar or for the world?
For the world, in terms of resources that have been deployed and in terms of the, yes.
I mean, Qatar really is a one-off. You know, the 2026 World Cup, you know, it's 3 nations deliberately designed to be super cheap. All the stadiums are built. Whereas, you know, the $220 billion figure that I have myself bandied around, and people have said 250 billion, my understanding is that that is the cost of all of the infrastructure that is being built around the World Cup. And, you know, I mean, Qatar has taken this moment to use the World Cup really as a catalyst, not just for building 8 football stadiums, but we're talking about an entire metro system. We're talking about, in the case, I think of it's Lusail, I can't remember. I mean, we're talking a whole new city. We're actually just talking a whole city. This is obviously not an option for anybody else. And, you know, obviously a certain amount of this would have happened in Qatar anyway. You know, Qatar is on a kind of trajectory of economic and urban development. So all of this stuff, in a way, was going to happen at some level, whether they got the World Cup or not. I think the World Cup has accelerated it, given it focus and given it a particular form. Is it sustainable for the rest of the world to run World Cups like this? Absolutely not. You know, I mean, of course, it would be a madness. Is it sustainable for Qatar? I mean, obviously, Qatar can't carry on spending money, you know, like there's no tomorrow forever. But this is a very pivotal moment in Qatar. This is, I presume, a sort of one-off moment as they make the transition from, you know, in the end, which is this tiny little underpopulated and predominantly rural peninsula, into a kind of globally orientated city-state with a much bigger population. So, you know, what would be unsustainable is if they weren't building a lot of solar power. I mean, thinking about the question I would ask is not so much, is this sustainable, can we keep doing it, but is what is being built sustainable, economically, socially, environmentally? Will Qatar be able eventually to be carbon zero? Will Doha be a socially and economically sustainable city without loads of hydrocarbon money just being pumped into it, but have developed its own indigenous economies, skills, whatever? And I think that's the question to ask of Qatar 2022's development program and sustainability is, you know, what will it look like 20 years from now? I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I just think that's how we need to frame the question usefully.
Thank you, David. Let's go back to the Q&A feature. I apologize, Mayra Ashraf, but I will skip your question since I think David already talked about sustainability at the World Cup. Shama, one of my great students, is asking the following question. In The Age of Football, you wrote about an Egyptian film that portrays the citizens being alienated from the football spectacle and celebrations. This is a common thing to see in many countries where a portion of the community, often the immigrants or blue-collar workers, are alienated from certain spheres. In your opinion, how can a country ensure the inclusiveness of all people?
Well, there's a $64,000 question. That movie, which is called 1-0 and takes place when Egypt win at home the 2008 African Cup of Nations. I mean, part of the alienation and the disengagement from the national team comes from the fact that under Mubarak, you know, the Egyptian team increasingly was seen not as the tribunal representative of the nation, but of the regime, and where, you know, so much time and energy, you know, and endless political interference had made people alienated from their own national team. So I think that's a very sort of specific condition. But I think it's a good and wider question to ask is, you know, who thinks this is our, you know, this is our team? I mean, and this is an issue, you know, in England, where certainly in the 1970s and 80s, you know, if you were a black or Asian Briton or English person, you know, you looked at the England team and went, that doesn't represent me. And you looked at the crowd and you said, that doesn't represent me. Indeed, this is a hostile notion of the nation. Now here we are 30 years later with a much more inclusive, multi-ethnic society in which, you know, the national team is never less than half minority ethnic players or players of a minority ethnic background. So what can people do to make their teams feel inclusive? I mean, you know, it's like there are issues obviously of ethnicity. I mean, you know, is your team representative of the ethnic mix of your nation? But above all, how do you treat people once they're in that position? Because it's all very well having, you know, Romelu Lukaku playing for Belgium and Belgians thinking, oh yeah, no, we are a groovy, multinational, multicultural, non-racist society. And then the moment there's a problem, everyone's having a go in for being Congolese and African. So, you know, how we make our teams, it's like, how do we as the public, in a way, make our teams? You know, how do we respond to them? Who do we give a hard time to? I think we all, it's not just the responsibility of, I don't know, the Football Association, it's how we as publics around the world respond to and interpret what our football teams do.
Mehrdad Massoudi is writing us that there have been other World Cups held in between autumn and winter of Southern Hemisphere, like the one in Chile, 1962, for example. Thank you for that information, but I will not ask David to comment it because it's more of a fact, and skip this and move forward to my colleague Ross Griffin from Qatar University. And Ross is asking, David, could you speak about how the British media has covered the kafala system in relation to the presence of British contractors, subcontractors, design and architecture firms in Qatar, which was at one point worth 20 billion GBP to those firms, according to a report in The Guardian 3 to 4 years ago?
Badly is the answer. I mean, you know, it's not just the British. I mean, this goes for pretty much everyone who's covering it. The focus is inevitably on the Qatari, you know, at the top level, you know, the World Cup organisers or the Qatari government. There has been there have been a few reports of British firms, architects, and a lot of architects firms, a lot of structural engineers, construction companies, subcontractors who employ, who are responsible for human rights violations. I mean, that's the way generally, to be honest, where all of these things are reported. It's very rarely do the press have either the money or the tenacity to like go all the way down the value chain. I mean, this is a problem in dealing with, you know, Nike and Adidas, you know, and their subcontractors. I mean, I think the complexity of these projects and the complexity of subcontracting means that in the end, you know, you do have to hold the people at the top to account. Yeah, sure, there are all sorts of shoddy business going on by British and other firms in the subcontracting chain, but ultimately, you know, that's subcontractors for you. You know, responsibility and accountability ultimately has to be at the top. So it's not surprising that the Qatari authorities have had to take most of the flak. But clearly, they're not the only people involved in this.
Next question, Emmanuel Ortiz is asking whether you have seen the documentary The Workers' Cup, in which migrant workers compete in their own football tournament. Emmanuel is not from my class, but we watched the film recently in my class. What are your thoughts on, did you see the documentary, David?
I have, and what I would say is, you know, I would hope, I mean, you know, you don't see this generally this is not just about Qatar, but, you know, an awful lot of work and effort by the workers, you know, often with not just deaths, but all sorts of injuries, goes into making these mega events possible. I would really like to see them incorporated into the World Cup. I would really like to imagine a Qatari World Cup where, you know, migrant workers from Bangladesh, India and Pakistan could be seen in the stadiums, could be seen playing five-a-side football in the parks of Doha. You know, that would be, I mean, that would be great, you know, to imagine whether that is possible. Whether that's possible or not, I don't know. But I thought it was, yeah, I think the key thing with watching the Workers' Cup is humanizing the statistics. You know, it's like, that's so important. We all talk about these things and it's about numbers, and it's like, it's real people with families and loves and lives and children. And I just thought it's really important sometimes, just like, instead of talking about migrant workers en masse, it's like, we need to see and meet and be introduced to these people as people. And I thought it was really, really good for that.
Yeah, I can just encourage everybody to watch the movie, although it's a bit sad. Next question is by an anonymous attendee. Why do hosting duties raise eyebrows politically when we are discussing sporting events in Moscow or Beijing? Why does it not matter when a country bombs Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, etc., and then gets to host the Olympics or the World Cup?
Well, welcome to the unfairness of the international global system. I mean, yeah. Right, of course. What do you expect? I mean, lots of people, as it happens, did protest, of course, against the bombing of Vietnam. I mean, and if we're talking about, I mean, these are events from the 1970s when, you know, the IOC is run by militant anti-communists like Avery Brundage. So, like, well, of course, you know, or indeed Sir Stanley Rouse and João Havelange at FIFA, who both, you know, are very much from the right of the political spectrum and were definitely Cold War warriors. So, like, obviously that's to be expected. I don't really quite understand the point, to be honest. Are we saying people are not hard enough on America when they get awarded something, but we're hard on Moscow and Beijing?
Yeah. I would like to skip the next question, as I believe we discussed migrant labor issues around the World Cup already. Next question is by Luis Enrique Rolem, who worked for a long period of time in Qatar. Luis, I don't know where you're now based, but we met some years ago in Qatar. And Luis is asking, until 2010, Qatar football team biggest achievements in the playing field were the Golf Cups. Aspire Academy was set up looking for grassroots talents mainly outside Qatar or Qatar non-passport holders in Doha. As we know, social ascension is one of the great motivations to youth engage in football, but it seems the high per capita and top-down decisions are not making Qataris interested in become professional footballers. In your opinion, how does a 2022 World Cup could be a driving force to engage locals as active footballers and not only football managers?
You've got to make it fun. I mean, we're back to Iceland, aren't we? I mean, yeah. if it's the case, and I think you're probably right, that, you know, the blessed wealth that the average Qatari citizen, not migrant worker, but Qatari citizen has available to them of going, professional football? Maybe not, you know, I mean, it's a gamble. And you can see there are lots of other options. So that's not about to change. So your options are twofold. You know, you have to kind of imagine maybe you could nurture talent and get people to play professional on the football, that it's just fun and they're good at it. And you also have to think about, well, you've got a great big migrant workforce. You know, you've got all these folks living in Qatar. If you really want more professional footballers, you probably need to give more of them citizenship. I would go back to the Iceland point and say, you know, first of all, raise the rate of participation. Then you can think about whether people are going professional or not. And I think Qatar has made, obviously, considerable efforts in this department. But I think mobilizing your own people, mobilizing their own energies is just the most important thing for that. And I don't know enough about Qatar to be able to answer accurately, but I suspect the balance between state and civil society is rather too heavily in the direction of the state at the moment in this area.
I would like to skip the next question on the blockade, as we have already discussed this. Professor Griffin makes a comment which I believe is important. Only 6 of the 23 men Asian Cup winning team were born outside of Qatar, a number compared to European nations like Ireland, France, and others. I think it's an important, and it's more an issue, I believe, in other sports, David, like handball, with like non-Qatari players in the Qatari national team. Faisal Ahmed Kusal is asking how the World Cup 2022 made changes its neighboring countries' views on football pitches development helps with Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy made by Bangladeshi football culture and tradition.
I'm struggling to understand the meaning of that question.
Faisal, can you rephrase it maybe? Martina Sambon is asking on the relationship between sport and economics. I would like to ask David what he thinks about that, if and how sport is directly related to Qatari economic diversification, since it's also mentioned in the Qatar vision.
I mean, if we'd have been having this conversation 20 years ago, I'd have been saying, well, in the end, sport is actually, for all the talk of commerce and money, is actually very small beans in this world, and that its economic footprint is actually really minuscule. But I think in the last 20 years, the size, the global reach, the sheer turnover of the global sports industry has made it an economic player. I mean, obviously the data is a bit scratchy, but the global sports industry is something in the region of $600 billion a year, which makes it around 0.8, 0.9% of global GDP. And obviously in some countries, and in particularly in some urban areas, you know, sport is considerably more than that. So I think we are in I think it does actually is an economic factor. The real issue, it strikes me with sport and economics, is that once you start applying crass forms of profit and loss and crude forms of neoliberal economics to it, then the whole thing becomes a disaster. In the end, sport's not going to make, you know, great amounts of profit for anything other than its star individuals. It's not going to be something that generates loads of other economic activity. I think the focus needs to be on how sport shapes, sustains, has an impact on other economic sectors. I mean, just obviously in the most sort of crude way, you could argue that, you know, if more people played more sport, we'd be spending less money on our health service, you know, freeing up economic capital for all sorts of other needs. All right, there's a crude chain of thought. And I think when we think about the economic consequences of sport, it's a much more rounded, holistic understanding of the relationship between economy, society, and culture is the frame through which we should view it, rather than just as a kind of ugly money-making machine.
Yes. I would like to skip the next two questions by Danny Hanoun on economics and Islamophobia. I think we discussed them both, but thanks for asking them. I know we are coming to them delayed, so then in the meantime, some of them have already answered. The same applies to Mehat Masoudi's comment on the Qatari squad that won the Asian Cup, which is similar to the comment by Professor Griffin. Thank you, but thank you, Mehat, for your comment. Then we have an interesting question by an anonymous attendee. So since the World Cup will be held in winter, how it affects those leagues that have to stop. And what's your comment on this, David?
I will, if I may, just respond to the point that was made about 6 players again in the Qatar team. I just want to say, I don't have a problem at all with Qatar having foreign migrants in their team who require citizenship and nationalization. I mean, it's been done in a slightly, it's not a kind of a product of the larger informal economic migrations that have come from the, you know, Africa and Asia to Western Europe. My issue with it, if I have one, is to say, okay, if you're going to do this, why, A, what is the recompense for African football? And B, when is your multicultural, multi-ethnic version of Qatar and your football team going to be available to everybody else and not just footballers? That's my point about it. I don't have a problem with it at all. Okay, back to the question, winter. I mean, whatever the impact is, it's not going to be as bad as COVID-19. I mean, again, if we'd have been having this conversation a year ago, we'd have been saying, oh, it's going to be terribly disruptive, it's going to affect team formation, people aren't going to like it, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, after COVID-19? Like, how bad can it be? I mean, sure, it's going to have an impact, but I think it's going to sort of just, it's a pretty small, in the scheme of things, it will be reasonably small.
Yeah, so we have reached 90 minutes, but of course we can have a bit of extra time as every football match has. I would like to skip the question by Danny and by Buwan on the COVID situation as we discuss them. Also, Merdat, this is more of a comment that Bahraini fans flew into Qatar to watch the team play in the Gulf Cup final against Saudi Arabia in December 2019. All right, now Camilla Swart, as a South African, is writing, I would disagree with your take on South Africa. The legacy is much more nuanced, especially in terms of intangibles. Changing perceptions and images, addressing Afro-pessimism, etc. Tourism also, in fact, increased in years thereafter. I bet that one can't make a direct link to 2010.
I don't know which, I mean, I haven't really spoken about 2010 today, so perhaps Camilla is referring to something I've written. I mean, I certainly agree that in terms of the intangibles, both domestically and internationally, there was a considerable positive impact of the 2010 World Cup. And I think countering, you know, the crudest forms of Afro-pessimism, though there's plenty of that still around, I think it did make a dent in that. I think it was a practical fill-up for the notion of Pan-Africanism that, you know, no amount of African Union meetings are ever going to generate. I do think, though, that the legacy in terms of stadiums is poor. I think it's really, really poor. I mean, you know, terrible, terrible, foolish waste of money on Cape Town Greenpoint, on Polokwane. I mean, you know, they just should have built a small stadium in Athlone where people actually like football in the Cape Flats and left the golfers to it at Greenpoint. So I think it's a mixed record in South Africa. I think, you know, there have been, to say it's a sort of, you know, complete write-off, absolutely not. Lots of good positive things about it. But I do think the actual infrastructure was poorly, very, very poorly invested. And FIFA carry some of the can for that, but South Africa carry some of the can too.
Camilla, I think you want to respond by audio. Please feel free to do so.
Yes, sorry, David, it wasn't directed at you. It was a comment by one of the participants posting where he indicated that all the examples he had raised were all very negative, and in that was including South Africa. So I was just pointing out that it was a little bit more nuanced. So it wasn't directed at something that you had said. I had just commented on the post.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe we take two more questions. One is by my colleague from Qatar University, Mahfoud Amara. He's asking how technology will change the World Cup experience.
I mean, I think the technology has already changed the World Cup experience. I mean, you know, in a way, one can almost write the narrative of the whole World Cup experience since 1930 in terms of changing forms of communication, from radio to film, then to television, then to color television, satellite, digital, the internet, etc. So that has made a huge difference and shaped the, you know, the spectacle and the wider experience of the World Cup in a really profound way. One of the ways in which I think technology is affecting football in a very negative way, and the World Cup is only one instance of this, is people's obsession with their smartphones. I have spent a lot of time in football stadiums, including World Cup stadiums, where people spend a lot of money to get there. And it's like you're on Twitter for the whole first half. I mean, I slightly despair. I do slightly despair. And the more I hear World Cup organisers and football organisers of all kinds saying, we must have better Wi-Fi in the stadium, I'm actually of the opinion that they should turn the Wi-Fi off during the game. You can put it on at half time, you can have it on, but I actually think turn it off during the game. I mean, really, is there anything more dismal than a whole group of people watching a, you know, it's like hundreds of people doing this. Call me old school. I actually think the way it fragments concentration. You know, football's a game of flow. You've got to be there in the flow, in the moment. You know, and if you're looking at some scraggy old WhatsApp from your ex-girlfriend, you know, you're going to miss it. So maybe I'm, you know, being a little utopian, but I actually think I think the biggest impact is on crowd behaviour due to smartphones, and I'd really like less of it. Yeah,
David, we should mention that you are on Twitter. And people can follow you if they want, but they should not check your tweets during matches. Let's have the last question by Peter. I assume the correct pronunciation is Dietsche. He's asking a very relevant question on sport activism, and which has been the major topic of this year with like Black Lives Matter, etc. And whether you think that this will be also become an issue at the World Cup, whether it will continue at World Cups.
I mean, yes, and I think it should. I mean, I don't see why only the hosts or national governments should be allowed to play politics with football. Why only them? Why not everybody else? Even when it's kind of political issues and attitudes that I find distasteful. I do think people should stop invading the pitch for their cause. I've had enough of that. We had a lot of that at Brazil 2014 in particular. I think we will see some of that, and I think FIFA should loosen up a bit. I mean, for example, you know, the campaign around women getting access to sports stadiums and sports in general in Iran, open stadiums, has used World Cups and international football tournaments as a really good platform. Although, stick your banner up, remind people that, you know, there you are watching Iran, but back home there are millions of Iranian women who aren't being allowed into the stadium. I think that's cool, and I would hope that there would be more of that, actually. You know, so I think there's also an opportunity, you know, it's not just in the stadiums, but around the World Cup, for encouraging people to have conversations and engage with all of the social issues, you know, of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, of access for the disabled, of environmental issues. It's like, we all want this to be part of the football experience. We should expect some activism around that at World Cups, and tolerate it and even celebrate it.
All right. Thank you, David. I think that was great. Apologies to those which questions could not be answered, but I think a vast majority of the questions were answered. Before I give the final word to Dean Dalal, I would just like to advertise our next event on Monday, November 16 at 6 p.m. with Matthias Krug, who wrote this book entitled Journeys on a Football Carpet on Qatar Football History. Thank you very much, David. And Dean Dalal, please have the last words.
Well, thank you very much, David. Thank you, Daniel. This was an amazing discussion. And please stay tuned. We'll continue with this lecture series, and stay tuned for the CIRS World Cup project, which will be rolling out very soon. Thank you.